My father is forcing me to become a serial killer like him. I always knew something was wrong with my father. Even as a child, I could feel it. An emptiness behind his eyes, a coldness in his voice, a detachment from the world that no other parent seemed to have. He never laughed, never showed real affection, but he was patient, and in his own way, he loved to teach. At first, it was hunting. Every man needs to learn how to kill, he told me when I was 8. Pressing the cold metal of a hunting knife into my small hands, I remember the way he stood behind me, guiding my fingers, whispering instructions as we tracked a deer through the dense woods behind our house. You have to be quiet. You have to be smart. You have to enjoy the feeling of the kill. I hated it. I remember the way the deer's body convulsed, the way its eyes locked onto mine as its life bled away into the dirt. My hands shook for hours after, but my father simply clapped a hand on my shoulder and said, "Good, but you'll get better." And he was right. I did get better, but not in the way he wanted. I got better at faking it, better at hiding the disgust, better at pretending to listen, pretending to learn, because I already knew one day hunting wouldn't be enough. One day he'd want me to kill something that could fight back. And that day came on my 17th birthday. That night, my father led me down into the basement. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The air was different, heavy, suffocating, and the smell, God, the smell. Coppery, thick. I almost turned and ran, but then he flicked the light switch, and I saw her, tied to a chair in the center of the room, blindfolded, mouth gagged. Her chest rose and fell in sharp, panicked breaths. Her wrists were bound so tightly the rope cut into her skin. I knew her. I knew her. It was Emily, a girl from my class. And when I turned to my father, he was smiling for the first time in my life. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The room closed in around me, the low hum of the basement light buzzing in my skull. Emily let out a muffled sob. My father sighed, as if disappointed, as if I had forgotten something important. He stepped forward, his boots clicking against the concrete floor, and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Happy birthday, son," he said, his voice warm, almost proud. "It's time you became a man." I stared at him, my chest tight, burning. "Dad, what did you do?" His grip on my shoulder tightened. "What we always talked about." He gestured to Emily, her body trembling, her muffled cries barely audible over my own pounding heartbeat. "I told you this day would come. It had to be someone special, someone you knew." I felt sick. "You're crazy," I whispered. His face darkened. "No, son, I'm awake. You're the one who's still blind." He took a step back, pulled something from behind his back, and held it out to me, a knife. The same hunting knife he gave me when I was 8. The blade was sharp, too sharp, like he had spent hours making sure it was perfect. "Do it," he said. Emily's head jerked up. She had heard him. She shook her head wildly, muffled screams tearing from her throat. I clenched my fists. I was going to die. If I refused, he would kill me. I knew that now. I had seen the way he looked at me growing up, waiting, measuring, testing. I had always thought he was just strict, just distant, but now I understood. This had always been the plan. I took the knife. My father smiled, and for the first time, I realized I had never really had a choice. The knife felt wrong in my hands, too heavy, too solid, like the weight of it was sinking into my skin, dragging me down into something I couldn't escape from. My fingers curled around the handle, but my grip was weak. My body knew what my father wanted, but my mind was screaming against it. Emily let out another muffled sob, her body shaking violently in the chair. The gag in her mouth muffled the sound, but it didn't hide the raw terror in her breathing, the way her chest hitched, the way her whole body flinched away from me. She was pleading. Even without words, I could feel it. She was begging me to save her. I couldn't do this. But my father was still standing behind me, his presence thick in the air, his breath slow and patient, like he had all the time in the world. He wasn't angry, not yet. His voice was calm, dangerously calm. "Go on," he murmured, stepping around me. "Take your time. I know it's hard at first." I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my pulse hammering. "Let her go," I said. My voice sounded thin, weak. My father sighed, shaking his head like a disappointed teacher. "You're not listening, son. This is important. I'm teaching you." He crouched down beside Emily, his hand settling on her shoulder, his fingers digging into her bare skin. She flinched violently, a muffled scream escaping her lips. I snapped, "Get your hands off her." My voice cracked with rage, raw and sharp. But the moment I took a step forward, my father's head snapped toward me. His face was empty. No anger, no frustration, just a cold, measured stare. "You don't give me orders," he said softly. I froze. His eyes locked onto mine, And suddenly, I was 7 years old again, standing in the woods, clutching a knife with trembling hands while a dying deer kicked weakly at the dirt. "Kill it, or I'll kill it for you," he had said then. And now it was Emily. He reached behind him, pulling something from the table against the wall, a smaller knife, thinner, sharper. Then, in one swift motion, he pressed the blade against Emily's throat. My stomach dropped. "One of us is doing this tonight," he said, his voice still so calm, so patient, like he was giving me a choice. But it wasn't a choice. It never had been. I knew what he was saying. If I didn't do it, he would. And if he did, it wouldn't be quick. Emily let out a choked whimper, tears spilling down her face, her entire body shaking violently against the ropes. I was going to be sick. This was it. This was the moment that would decide everything. My father watched me, waiting. Emily's breathing hitched, her chest rising and falling in shuddering sobs, and my fingers tightened around the knife. I didn't make the choice. My body did. I lunged, not at Emily, but at my father. I didn't even think. 1 second I was frozen. The next my hand was gripping the knife like it belonged there, like it had been waiting for this moment. The blade sliced through the air, aiming for his throat, for his chest, for anything that would make this end. But my father was faster. His hand shot out, catching my wrist before the blade could make contact. The force of it sent a jolt of pain through my arm, my fingers numbing instantly. Then he twisted. I screamed. The knife clattered to the ground as my own arm bent the wrong way, my wrist burning as he forced me down to my knees. His other hand gripped the back of my neck, shoving me down, forcing my face toward the concrete floor. "Disappointing," he murmured. Pain shot through my body as he tightened his grip, pinning me down. My vision blurred, but I could still hear Emily sobbing violently in the chair, gasping for air through the gag. This was it. This was where I died. I squeezed my eyes shut, but then something happened. Something he didn't expect. Emily moved. I didn't see it, but I heard it. The sharp creak of the chair, the sound of wood splintering, rope straining, and then a scream. Not Emily's, my father's. I jerked my head up just in time to see Emily's body slam into his, the chair still bound to her arms, the broken wood jabbing into his ribs. For the first time, my father lost control. He stumbled backward, cursing, the knife in his hand falling to the ground. I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my own knife and lunged again, this time aiming for his side, for the exposed flesh near his ribs. The blade sank deep. He let out a sharp gasp, his body jerking violently, but I didn't let go. I twisted the knife, my hands slick with warmth, with blood. He staggered back, eyes wide. For the first time in my life, I saw real fear in his face. His mouth opened. He was trying to say something, but I didn't care. I ripped the knife free, and before he could move, before he could even try to stop me, I raised it and buried it in his throat. The room went silent. For a moment, he just stood there, choking, his hands clawing weakly at the handle. Blood poured down his chest, spilling onto the floor, onto my hands. Then, slowly, he fell. His body hit the ground with a heavy thud. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Emily was still sobbing behind me, still gasping for air, but all I could do was stare at him, the man who had controlled my entire life. The man who had tried to turn me into a monster, and in the end, I had killed him first. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at his body. It didn't feel real. The knife was still in my hand, slick with his blood, and no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise, I had done it. I had killed my father. I should have felt relief. I should have been shaking, throwing up, crying, something, but all I felt was empty. His body lay motionless on the cold concrete floor. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the cracks. His eyes, those cold, calculating eyes that had studied me my whole life, were still open, staring. Emily was panting behind me, still tied to the broken chair, her breath raw and uneven. I turned slowly, my movements stiff, mechanical. Her face was streaked with tears. Her lips cracked from the gag. She had stopped struggling. She was waiting for me. I forced myself to move. My legs felt weak, unstable, but I crouched down beside her, fumbling with the knots. My hands were shaking, sticky with blood and sweat, but I kept pulling, loosening the rope until finally, she was free. She ripped the gag from her mouth, gasping, and then she screamed, not at me, at his body. Her voice was raw, piercing, like the sound of everything that had just happened was finally breaking through. She scrambled back, nearly tripping over herself, her hands clutching at her own arms like she was trying to convince herself she was still real. I reached for her. Emily, She flinched away, her wide, tear-filled eyes locked onto mine, And for the first time, I realized she was afraid of me, not of my father, of me, because I had been the one holding the knife. I had been the one standing over his body. I had been the one who had just killed a man. I swallowed hard, my throat burning. "Emily, please." She turned and ran. I was too slow to stop her. Her footsteps pounded up the basement stairs, the door slamming open as she disappeared into the night. And just like that, I was alone. Alone with the body, alone with what I had done. The blood was on my hands, on my clothes, on the floor, in the air. No matter how hard I tried to breathe, the smell was everywhere. And suddenly, I couldn't take it. I dropped the knife, staggered to the sink, and scrubbed my hands under the freezing water, harder, harder, until my skin was raw and burning. But the blood wouldn't wash off, because it wasn't just on me, it was in me. And for the first time, I had the horrible, gut-wrenching thought, maybe this was always going to happen. Maybe my father had been right all along. I couldn't stay. Not here, not in his house, even with his body lying there, motionless, lifeless. I could still feel him. The walls still held his presence, his lessons, his rules. His voice was still in my head, whispering things I didn't want to hear. "You did well, son. Now you understand. You were always meant for this." No, no. I shoved the thoughts away, forcing myself to move. My hands were still trembling as I grabbed my car keys, stuffing them into my pocket. I didn't pack anything. I didn't clean up. I just had to get out. But when I reached the front door, I hesitated. Not because I wanted to stay, but because I suddenly realized there was nowhere to go. If Emily went to the police, they'd come straight here. And when they did, what would they see? A dead man, and his son standing over the body, covered in his blood. No one would believe the truth. How could they? I could already hear the questions. Why didn't you run sooner? Why didn't you tell anyone? How do we know you're not just like him? And I had no answers, because I had waited. I had stayed. I had learned his lessons. And in the end, I had killed him. Not out of self-defense, not out of fear, but because something inside me had snapped. And for the briefest, most terrifying moment, it had felt right. A sharp knock shattered the silence. I froze. 3 knocks, slow, deliberate. I turned toward the door, heart hammering. It wasn't the police. It wasn't Emily. I didn't know how I knew that, but I did. I took a slow step forward, every muscle in my body tense. The air around me suddenly thicker, suffocating. The knock came again. Then, a voice, deep, familiar. "Son." My blood ran cold. That wasn't possible. I had killed him. I had seen the light leave his eyes, hadn't I? The door handle turned slowly, and suddenly I wasn't sure anymore, because this house, his house, was still breathing. And maybe, just maybe, so was he. The door handle kept turning, slow, deliberate. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My entire body was locked in place, a deep, primal part of my brain screaming at me to run, hide, fight, anything but stand here and wait for whatever was on the other side. "Son." The voice was his, exactly his, not an echo, not a memory, not some trick of my own unraveling mind. My father was on the other side of the door. I had killed him, hadn't I? I had felt the blade sink into his ribs, watched his blood spill onto the floor, heard the wet, choking gasp as he finally realized that he wasn't going to win. I had seen his lifeless body on the basement floor, and yet, the door handle clicked, the lock released. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet, hands clenching into fists, my pulse hammering against my ribs. My legs felt weak, my stomach twisting violently as I stared at the door, waiting for it to swing open. But it didn't. It just stood there, slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling into the hallway. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. My mind was scrambling for an answer, for a reason, for something that made sense. Emily had left the door unlocked when she ran. Maybe someone else had come in. Maybe this was just a cop checking the place. Maybe, "You're thinking too much, son." I flinched. The voice was closer now, inside the house. I whipped around, but the hallway was empty. The house was silent, but I felt him. Every hair on my body stood on end. The air was thick, heavy, suffocating. I could almost smell him. The faint metallic scent of blood and sweat and cigarettes. The smell that had clung to him my entire childhood. This wasn't real. Couldn't be real. I turned slowly, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The basement door was still open, the darkness inside thick, yawning. I had to look. I had to see. Even though I already knew what I would find. I forced my legs to move, stepping forward one slow shaking step at a time. The smell of blood grew stronger. The walls seemed closer than before. The house itself felt smaller, like it was closing in. I reached the basement door, and then I looked, and my stomach dropped. The body was gone. The floor was still stained with blood, a thick dark pool seeping into the cracks of the concrete. The scent so strong it made my eyes burn. But my father, he wasn't there. There was no drag marks, no footprints, just emptiness. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering against my skull. My head felt light, my hands shaking violently. This wasn't happening. This wasn't. You never were very good at cleaning up after yourself. The voice came from behind me. I spun violently, my breath catching in my throat. Every muscle in my body screaming, run, fight, do something. But there was nothing there, just the basement walls, just the old wooden shelves, the rusted tools, the lingering scent of rotting flesh. I was losing it. I had to be. Maybe I had blacked out. Maybe I had moved the body myself. Maybe Emily had. No. She had been tied up. She was terrified. She ran. She didn't do this. But if she didn't, then who did? Still thinking too much. The voice was closer now. I staggered back, nearly tripping over my own feet, my breathing sharp and uneven. I needed to get out. Now I turned and froze. The knife was back in my hand, not the small kitchen knife I had grabbed to cut Emily's ropes. The hunting knife, the one I had used to kill him. I gasped, dropping it instantly. It clattered against the concrete, spinning wildly before coming to a dead stop. My hands were shaking so badly, my vision blurred. Go on, pick it up. Number, you did it once. You can do it again. No, I staggered backward, heart hammering against my ribs. The walls seemed closer. The house felt smaller. You felt it, didn't you? My stomach clenched. The moment the knife went in, I squeezed my eyes shut. Stop. You liked it. My hands clenched into fists. You were always meant for this. I ran. I bolted up the basement stairs, taking them two at a time, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. The moment I reached the main floor, I slammed the basement door shut, locking it, my breath coming in wild, uneven gasps. The house was quiet again, but I knew I wasn't alone. Not anymore, because the blood was still on my hands. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't convince myself that I wasn't just like him. Maybe I had been all along. I didn't sleep. I didn't turn off the lights. I just sat in the living room, staring at the locked basement door, the old wooden floors creaking beneath my every breath. The air in the house felt thick, like something was pressing down on me, waiting. The knife lay on the table in front of me. I didn't remember putting it there, but I must have. Who else could have? I tried to tell myself this was just my mind unraveling. Trauma, guilt, shock. Emily had run. My father was dead. His body must have decomposed faster than I thought. Or maybe some wild animal dragged it away. Except I knew that wasn't true, because this house hadn't let him leave. And I knew that because he was still here. I could feel him. In the walls. In the floorboards. In the goddamn air. You can't stay here forever, son. The voice came from everywhere at once. My breath hitched. My stomach flipped. I forced myself to stand, every muscle in my body trembling. Shut up. My voice was hoarse, raw, no response, just silence. Then, a slow creaking sound, not from the basement, from upstairs. I turned sharply, my body locking up with ice-cold fear. The air was different now, heavier, wrong. The old staircase led up to my father's room, but he was dead, wasn't he? My legs started moving before my brain could stop them. One step, then another. The wooden stairs groaned under my weight, the sound stretching through the empty house. At the top, the hallway was dark, too dark. The overhead light was off, but the shadows seemed deeper, like they were watching me. I reached my father's bedroom door. It was open, just a sliver, enough for me to see inside. The bed was made. The room was neat, except for one thing. The closet door was wide open, and inside, I saw a pair of shoes. Not empty. Someone was standing in there. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Then, the shoes took a single step forward. I ran. I didn't stop running until I was outside. The night air hit me like a slap, cold and sharp, burning my lungs. My legs were shaking, my heart hammering so violently it felt like it was trying to claw out of my chest. The house loomed behind me, dark and watching. I could still feel him inside it. Not a ghost, not a memory, something worse. I forced my breath to steady. Think. I needed to leave. I needed to find Emily. The police, anyone, but my car keys were still inside. Back in the house, back in the same place he was. I turned toward the tree line, my mind racing. Maybe I could walk, maybe I could. The front door creaked open. I froze. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Something stepped onto the porch, and I knew, before I even turned around, I knew it was him. Not my father, not really, but something that looked like him. The thing stepped forward, its bare feet silent against the dirt. The porch light flickered, casting a dim, sickly glow across its face, and my stomach turned to ice, because it wasn't just wearing his face. It was wearing his body, but wrongly. The features were too stiff, too stretched, too unnatural. The skin didn't move right, the way he blinked. Too slow, too deliberate, like it was reminding itself how human eyes were supposed to work. It wasn't him. It was something else, wearing him. And then, it smiled. And in my father's voice, it whispered, "You shouldn't have done that, son." I took a step back. So did he. Perfectly, exactly, like a reflection. The thing wearing my father's skin tilted its head, watching me with calm, patient curiosity. His lips curled into a small, knowing smile. And for the first time, I realized this was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment when I would finally understand. "You feel it now, don't you?" he murmured. His voice was low, smooth, comforting. Not the voice of a monster, the voice of a teacher. The connection, the pull, the blood. "It's always been in you." I shook my head violently. "You're not real." My voice came out hoarse, raw, trembling. "I killed you." He chuckled softly. "Did you?" I opened my mouth to argue, but the words died in my throat, because suddenly, I wasn't standing outside anymore. I was back in the basement. The floor was clean. No blood, no broken chair, no knife. And my father was standing right in front of me, like he had never left. I let out a sharp breath, staggering backward, my head spinning. My heart was pounding violently. "No, no, no, no. You've been here the whole time, son," he whispered. My stomach twisted violently. "You never left this room." I squeezed my eyes shut. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I had left. I had killed him. I turned, desperate to find the stairs. But there were no stairs anymore, just walls, and a single mirror. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. Because in the reflection, I wasn't myself anymore. I was him. I stumbled back, my entire body shaking. My reflection didn't move. It just stared at me, smiling. I grabbed my head, my fingers digging into my scalp, forcing myself to breathe, forcing myself to wake up. "This isn't real," I muttered. "This isn't real. Why fight it?" The voice came from inside my head now. My father, or whatever he was now, was gone. And yet, he was everywhere. "You know the truth, son." The reflection tilted its head. "You were always meant for this." I squeezed my eyes shut. No, that wasn't true. Except, hadn't I always known? The way I had learned so easily. The way my hands had stopped shaking the moment I buried the knife in his ribs. The way I had felt something inside me snap. Not in fear, but in recognition. Like I had finally become who I was supposed to be. I let out a slow, shuddering breath. The reflection smiled wider. "It's time for the final lesson." My vision blurred, twisted, shattered, and when it cleared, I was outside again. Emily was standing in front of me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with horror. She had come back. She had come back to see if I was okay. But now, she wasn't sure, because I was standing in the middle of the yard, with the knife in my hands, and I was smiling. I didn't remember picking it up. I didn't remember walking outside. But suddenly, I understood. The final lesson wasn't about killing my father. It was about becoming him. Emily took a step back, her mouth opened, to scream, to beg, to run. But I was already moving, and this time, my hands didn't shake.